All right, everyone, welcome to GIA Knowledge Sessions, a series of talks and seminars about gemology fueled by our decades of research. At GIA, we consider ourselves so fortunate to study and learn from gems, and it's our mission to share discoveries and learnings about gemology with the world. I'm excited to kick things off today. My name is Natalie Jaden. I'm the Content Marketing Manager at GIA, and today I'm joined by Dr. Erin Palke, Senior Manager of Research at GIA, and Emerald Tanner, a Southwest Native American art dealer. Before we get started, just a few things for housekeeping. Everyone is automatically muted, and if you have any questions, please submit it to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to ask questions as we go. At the end, there'll be a Q&A session where Dr. Palke and Emerald can answer some of your questions. We'll also send a recording of the session to you later today and a message so that we can get a survey, and we'd love to hear your feedback. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to you, Dr. Palke.
Thanks, Natalie. So the idea behind this webinar today was we know everybody out there is missing Tucson right now. We all wish we were in Tucson for the show, meeting with friends and seeing all the wonderful gems and jewelry that everybody brought along with them. But also we know you guys miss some of that Southwest flavor from Tucson. You might miss going into your favorite Mexican restaurant, seeing the architecture, seeing fantastic pieces of Southwest jewelry. So we wanted to try to bring a little bit of that flavor back to you guys today. I'm joined by Emerald, and Emerald's going to show you some really fantastic pieces of turquoise jewelry later today. And we wanted to kind of introduce a little bit of the gems of the Southwest to kind of bring you back a little bit. And hopefully next year, we'll all meet again in Tucson and be able to see each other in person again. Now, I want to start off though a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about geology. I'm going to talk about why the Southwest, I guess when I say Southwest, I mean more specifically the Southwest United States. So we're talking mostly Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, Southern California to an extent. But I want to talk about why the Southwestern United States is important for gemstones. And to do that, I want to kind of take a little step back as well and talk about where colored stones, so rubies, sapphires, emeralds, anything that's not a diamond, basically, where do these stones form in the world in a geological sense? And I'm using this diagram that was from our Winter 19 Gems and Gemology issue, showing some of the geological environments in which ruby and sapphire specifically can form. And basically, this is a lot of the similar to other gemstones as well, other colored stones. There's kind of two environments in which they form. There's areas of crustal thickening, which I'm showing kind of right here. This is essentially when we had these periods of continental collision, especially when we had these periods of supercontinent amalgamation. So you think of like the supercontinent Gondwana. When East and West Gondwana collided with each other, the immense pressures and conditions of formation that collided these two continents ended up building these enormous mountain chains, creating these huge orogenic belts. So an orogenic belt is basically just a big mountain chain created by continental collision. And also creating these intense conditions of pressure and temperature, these intense metamorphic conditions when these rocks were buried underneath each other. And these conditions of pressure and temperature were what was necessary to create gemstones within the Earth's crust. Now, the other kind of general area in which you can form gemstones in the Earth, and specifically colored stones, are areas of crustal thinning, which is sort of the opposite case, where you're essentially ripping apart continents, thinning out the crust. And in many cases, what happens then is that you can allow all of these volcanic events to happen. So you start melting parts of the Earth's mantle or crust, as shown here in this sort of mantle plume. And these molten rocks start to make their way up through the Earth's surface to the crust. And in some cases, they can bring along little gemstones with them. These are xenocryst, foreign crystals within the magmas. And they just happen to be transported along by these volcanoes to the Earth's surface. And in some cases, the volcanic events themselves are related to the gemstone formations. And that's kind of shown here on this map, which I'm using a colleague of mine, Wim Vertriest, put this map together. These are locations of GIA field expeditions over the last 10 years. And what you'll see is that a lot of our field expeditions, these were expeditions where we went to gemstone mines in order to collect gemstones as close to the source as possible. What you'll see is that a lot of them are concentrated in East Africa, for instance, and Sri Lanka, and then throughout Southeast and East Asia. And there's a couple of reasons for this. So if we look at the gemstones from East Africa and Sri Lanka, this is part of what we call the Mozambique orogeny. And this is what I mentioned earlier when we had this amalgamation of the supercontinent Gondwana. When East and West Gondwana collided with each other, they formed this huge orogenic metamorphic belt called the Mozambican orogeny. And that includes as well Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka was caught up right in the middle of these two supercontinents when they collided. And this created the perfect conditions for creating all of these gemstones all throughout Eastern Africa, into Madagascar and Sri Lanka. The other important one I'll point out now is the Himalayan orogeny. So throughout East Asia and Southeast Asia, we have all these gemstone deposits of emeralds, rubies, and sapphires. And most of these deposits were created when the Indian subcontinent was colliding with the Asian continent, creating this huge orogenic belt, the Himalayan mountains, which created the metamorphic conditions necessary to create gemstones. There's a few more that are similar situations, like the emeralds and alexandrites from Russia were created in a similar environment. And for the most part, this is where a lot of our colored stones are formed. And that's just shown again in this map. I want to just drive this point home. You'll recognize some of these continents now: South America, Africa. This is India and Sri Lanka in here, Madagascar, that little island in the middle. This is what the world would have looked like around 550 million years ago, when the supercontinent was formed, all these continents colliding into each other, creating these orogenic belts shown in red. And these are actually showing the deposits of Paraíba tourmaline in the world. So Paraíba tourmaline occurs in Brazil, Nigeria, and Mozambique. It's directly related to this orogenic event when you had this amalgamation of the supercontinents into Gondwana. So let's talk about the Southwest then. Why do we find gemstones in the Southwest, and what were the conditions of formation there? And this is actually a little bit different than a lot of the other colored stone deposits in the world. The Southwest never really saw that same kind of supercontinent orogenic amalgamation that we see in some of the other colored stone deposits. There was a convergent margin on the western coast of the United States, or the western coast of North America at that time. So what I mean by that, there was subduction of an oceanic plate underneath the western coast of America, which ceased about 50 million years ago. But this actually was part of the gemstone formation in the Southwest. It didn't have the same kind of orogenic event, but there was a lot of magmatism that was occurring at this time. And a lot of this magmatism ended up causing a lot of copper mineralization throughout the Southwest and in the West, through the intrusion of granites that intruded into the Earth's crust, and the later fluids that were emitted from the granites, bringing copper mineralization into the surrounding country rocks. Now, this alone wasn't enough for the gemstones in the Southwest. There were also other factors that need to be taken into consideration, and one of those is the warm and arid conditions present in the Southwest, which was necessary to alter those copper deposits, and also the modern extensional tectonics, which also play a part in kind of bringing these gemstones to the Earth. So although there was a convergent margin about 50 million years ago, today, a lot of the Southwest has this basin and range topology, where the crust is actually starting to thin itself out a little bit. It's stretching itself out. And when the crust stretches itself out, it kind of brings some of these copper mineralization bodies to the Earth's surface, where they can be weathered and altered through secondary alteration in these warm, arid conditions that we experience today in the American Southwest. Now, before we get to the kind of the really star of the show today, which is turquoise, I want to just briefly introduce a couple other different types of gemstones we find in the Southwest. One important thing is opal. Now, we think of Australia and Ethiopia as being sources of opal, but there's been a lot of opal produced in the United States and in Mexico, especially in Nevada, all the way down into Mexico. And this is actually formed through interaction of these volcanic events that I spoke of earlier. So when the Earth's crust was thinning, it allowed room for volcanic events to come up into the Earth's crust, erupt onto the Earth. And in some cases, the volcanic formation that formed on the Earth's surface were later altered by the infiltration of groundwater and surface waters. And when that happened, the silica in some of these rocks was picked up and deposited in other places in the rocks, in the cracks and the pores of these volcanic formations. If that happened in such a way that you created these very tiny microspheres of silica that layered themselves in orderly patterns, you could form opal, where the opal is caused, the play of color in the opal is caused by the diffraction of light off of those tiny microspheres of silica deposited in these volcanic formations. You think of the Southwest, another thing you think about obviously is Peridot. The San Carlos Peridot, which is mined in the San Carlos Apache Indian Reservation in Arizona. And again, this is another volcanic gemstone. So this was formed when, again, the Earth's crust was thinning in this basin and range type of geological event. This allowed these alkali basalts to be erupted onto the Earth's surface. And these alkali basalts were sourced from the Earth's mantle, which was slowly starting to melt in this crustal thinning environment. And when the alkali basalt is shown here on the right in this photo, the basalt is actually this dark kind of black rock here with all these vesicles, all these gas bubbles, which you think of in volcanic events. But the actual gemstones are formed in these nodules contained within the basalt. And so what happened was, by sheer luck maybe, as the basalt was ripping its way through the Earth's mantle, it picked up little chunks, little pieces of the Earth's mantle as it was going along. And so these nodules, these green nodules formed of peridot, the mineral olivine, but also pyroxenes and other minerals. These are actually little remnants of the Earth's mantle, little time capsules coming from the Earth's mantle that we would never be able to access if these basalts hadn't been erupted onto the Earth's surface, which is actually kind of interesting to think about. All of the peridot that's still trapped down in the mantle we'll never get to access, but through, we were lucky enough to have these deposits in Arizona to bring some of that mantle up to us. And that's shown, some of the gemstones are shown here, these rings on the left, these peridot in the green, and then actually the amethyst here is also another Arizona gemstone. There's also another deposit of amethyst close to this deposit as well, close to the peridot deposit. But really the important part of gemstones in the Southwest is copper. And it's not just gemstones why this is important, but it's also important for the local economy. It's important in many ways in terms of the history of the population of the Southwest. And I'm shown here on the left is a photo of the famous Bisbee mine. And I think Emerald's got a better, more modern photo of that in her slides. But copper is really important for the Southwest. I think in Arizona, especially, they're producing maybe 60% of the national output of copper. And this is intimately related to the gemstones we'll be talking about as well. Now, there's certain gemstones we'll talk about with copper. Chrysocolla and chalcedony is a beautiful, stunning piece of gemstone that comes from some of these copper mines, directly from the copper mines. You also produce malachite and azurite that can be fashioned into nice gemstones and aesthetically pleasing pieces. But again, the star of the show is turquoise, and that's what we really want to focus on today. So turquoise is a copper aluminum phosphate mineral, a hydrated copper aluminum phosphate mineral. I'll talk a little bit about the gemology later, but basically this gemstone formed in these copper deposits when they were exposed at the surface in this extensional basin and range geological event, where the copper is exposed to the surface and you get this so-called, what a geologist would call supergene alteration, where groundwater is infiltrating into the copper deposit and is stripping away all the other materials, all the other minerals, and leaving behind the copper and iron and aluminum, and really concentrating all of those copper minerals at the Earth's surface and changing them into more beautiful stones like this turquoise. And with that, actually, I want to turn it over to Emerald now.
Well, good morning, everybody. First of all, thank you so much to GIA for hosting me today. Joining you from Gallup, New Mexico. We are a small community of about 20,000 people that borders the Navajo Nation and Zuni Pueblo as well, a big mecca of trade here in the Southwest. So happy to be here. Thank you so much to Dr. Palke, who's just a wealth of information, and honored to share the space with him today. And thank you to everyone for joining us. Turquoise. There is an almost haunting fascination with the stone dating back to Egyptian times when the stone was found in the use of ancient tombs, ancient adornment, and fashioned into gold jewelry, bracelets, rings, much like it's used in the Southwest today by Native Americans of the Greater Gallup tribes. The early existence in the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt are some of the earliest foundings of turquoise. And turquoise got its name by the French by way of Turkish traders who likely brought the stone to regions in Europe. Turquoise, as it relates to the Southwest, which is what my focus will be today, turquoise and the tribes of the Native American Southwest have a couple thousand-year history together, with prehistoric mining evidence existing in regions in northern New Mexico as well as Arizona. Behind me today, I have some examples of what turquoise looks like in raw nugget form, in finished jewelry form that you see me wearing, and you see samples behind. This is a large specimen of Arizona turquoise, just to kind of give you an idea of the size and scale of some of just the sheer grandeur of some of the nuggets that were produced out of some of the mines of the Southwest. Early turquoise mining was done by Native Americans of the northern New Mexico and Arizona tribes using early tools that were likely made of picks and axes made of bones and stones and alike materials. The turquoise at that time was soft enough to be fashioned and formed and made into rolled beads, into nuggets, and has been evidence found in sites like Chaco Canyon that have been the founding sites of early turquoise beads, much like these. The Tewa Native Americans, in addition to the Kiowa Pueblo or Santo Domingo Pueblo, were rolling these strands of turquoise. This is an example of New Mexico Cerritos turquoise. And these were an important means of trade, or a trade commodity, the hottest trade commodity at that time, dating back as early as 500 AD. The early turquoise trade, as I said, really a means of trade for the people of the area and region, with most of the trade happening at that time with pueblos and areas of the Rio Grande and, again, the northern New Mexico, Arizona regions, but eventually expanded to other areas as far south as the Aztec Empire in Mexico, where the trade occurred for things like copper, feathers, shells, to the California tribes. Again, the spondylus shell trade. Some of the earliest evidence of one of the historic lapidary techniques is a technique called mosaic inlay that was done by Kiowa Pueblo or Santo Domingo Pueblo, in addition to the Anasazi or Chacoan tribes. I have an example for you here. These are mosaic earrings, again, done by the Kiowa Pueblo. Before silver was brought onto the Southwest American market by way of Spanish and Mexican traders, turquoise lapidary work was done on things like shell and cottonwood. Some of the early examples of lapidary techniques that we see even used today by tribes of Santo Domingo Kiowa. Turquoise made its way up to the Northwest coast for trade with some of the Plains and Northwest Coast Native Americans for things like leather and hide trade. The bead traders, the wampum traders, or wampum rolled, the strung money, was some of the most sought after traders of the American Southwest at that time. About 1850, which was when my family arrived to the Southwest, traditional time trading posts started to establish across the American Southwest. This is my Grandpa Joe that I'd like to introduce you to here. He was a turquoise miner in addition to being a Southwest trader, and really a catalyst for a lot of the marriage of turquoise and silver that happened. In addition to being a turquoise miner in properties of Arizona, Grandpa Joe also dabbled in the importing of Mediterranean coral and Persian turquoise, which really set the standard for the color of turquoise. When you see Persian turquoise, though the property deposits a wide gamut of greens to blues, the most sought after color, and sort of the color that we think of when we hear the word turquoise, is this really brilliant robin's egg Persian blue. Around the turn of the century and up into the 19-teens, when the silver trade happened and turquoise was being fashioned by tribes of the Navajo, Zuni, and surrounding areas, Persian turquoise set in silver jewelry was, again, one of the hottest commodities of the time, much like the table rolled beads about 1,000 years prior. With that boom came this demand and this respect for mining turquoise, and you started to see more commercially mined turquoise properties in the 19-teens on up through the 30s, where we saw a boom and a demand for Southwest jewelry, and continued through the 1970s when so many of the Nevada deposits hit fabulous. With the incorporation by way of the Spanish-Mexican silver trade, Grandpa, as I said, was one of the characters that sort of formed this demand and helped spread the Southwest jewelry throughout the American Southwest, and by way of the railroad and characters and folks like C.G. Wallace, who was an early trader and turquoise miner, Fred Harvey, who popularized the look and feel of Native American jewelry, flooded the market and flooded it beautifully. I've put together a group of images that you'll see in hopes of giving you a taste of what the turquoise mines in the American Southwest look and feel like. So here's a nice diagram of some of the turquoise in the American Southwest. As you see, turquoise mostly comes from regions of the American Southwest, the Four Corners area, in addition to Nevada. There's about 300 turquoise mines in the American Southwest, with a huge emphasis on Arizona and Nevada especially. You see properties in Nevada. There's about 300 turquoise mines in the American Southwest, with about a third of those coming and showing from Nevada. Turquoise mines that I'll feature today, though I'd love to just talk about all of them. I've narrowed it down to 11 that we call the Big 11 that we feel really have been the most productive and contributed to the Southwest Native American jewelry market as it is today. So those mines are going to be Bisbee, Kingman, Morenci, Sleeping Beauty, which is one of the most famous mines of the American Southwest and just produced a huge amount of turquoise on the market. Sleeping Beauty is a very middle of the road turquoise mine as it relates to the type of turquoise it produced. Dr. Palke will get into some of the stabilization processes that occur within turquoise, but for now, we're just going to talk about natural turquoise. Lone Mountain, Lander Blue, Blue Gem, Fox, and Number 8 are all Nevada properties that we want to focus on. And of course, from New Mexico, Old Cerrillos, and then Villa Grove from Colorado. The next slide will showcase just a little bit of the feel that a turquoise mine has. Now, no turquoise mine is identical. No turquoise mine is exactly the same. But some of them, especially some in New Mexico, have almost a cave-like feel and look to them. Here, photoed in the center is Santo Domingo, Kewah Pueblo artist Anthony Lovato, who is a multi-generational lapidary artist and jeweler, looking up to the turquoise deposits at the Tiffany mine, joined by Mr. Doug Magnus, who is the current owner and operator of the Tiffany turquoise mine located just north of Santa Fe, New Mexico. The next slide will show you some examples of Old Cerrillos turquoise, which is one of the oldest turquoise properties in the American Southwest. Cerrillos produced really beautiful, brilliant green hues, getting into some of those lighter minty greens as well, with a fair amount of the light sky blue turquoise production. There's a photo captured of the Cerrillos Hills, again, located just outside of Santa Fe, that high desert sort of arid regions that Dr. Palke said was a contributor to the turquoise production in the American Southwest. Up next is an example of some of the properties from Colorado. Though Colorado didn't produce a wide array of turquoise mines, one that was really notable and really important to the turquoise industry was Villa Grove, Colorado. Villa Grove, along with some of the Nevada mines that I'll mention here in a bit, produced almost all gemstone. Almost all of the turquoise that came out of Villa Grove didn't require any sort of stabilization process. Again, it's that sort of high desert feel to it. And with the Villa Grove property, I have a good example of one of the largest specimens of the gem grade, gem quality turquoise, set beautifully in traditional Navajo silversmith style by Joe Yazzie. More on some of the silver techniques and lapidary techniques a little later today. Up next is a nice representation of Nevada, who is just the most famous state for turquoise production. There's turquoise produced all around the world. There's beautiful turquoise production that comes out of China, Tibet, Egypt, as I mentioned, Mexico. There's incredible turquoise from all over the world, but there is something so sought after and desired about Nevada properties. When Nevada hit and when the mines were discovered, it just created this incredible boom in the industry. One thing Nevada is notable for is the incredible intense spider web, which is just a word that works sort of interchangeably with words you hear like matrix or host rock. These are these beautiful patterns that you see within the turquoise stone. In this case, it's a dark web black matrix or a spider web. Matrix can also be seen lending golden hues, brown hues, and even sort of a light white, what we call water matrix that comes out of mines like Kingman, Arizona. There's a beautiful scape of the Gilbert mining district in Nevada that just sort of gives you an idea. Again, that sort of high desert, arid, almost tranquil space. Beautiful image loaded by a turquoise mining friend of mine, Jesse Robbins. Next slide is some of the Arizona properties. My favorite, Bisbee, referencing back to that lavender pit. There's an image of the famed lavender pit. Arizona properties in particular are often turquoise properties that were discovered as a byproduct of open pit copper mining. The copper contribution to the turquoise stone, again, Dr. Palke will get into this with some of the turquoise components in his portion of the presentation in a bit, but typically the more copper rich the turquoise property is, the more blue it is. That's what loans a lot of its color contribution. And the lavender pit gets its name, sort of a fun fact about Bisbee. You see within the stone here, this oversized cabochon, that's about 115 carats of beautiful Bisbee blue. Nobody had seen that deep blue, intense color quite like Bisbee produced in the Northwest, in the North American Southwest up until they saw Bisbee. It's comparable to the really brilliant blue of the Persian that I showed you earlier. So highly sought after and desired stone. And it has a sort of distinctive matrix. A lot of questions that come up when looking at turquoise and when reviewing turquoise is how do you tell where it comes from? And a telltale for a lot of these turquoise mines is the matrix or the host rock. And you see within the Arizona property here with Bisbee as an example, that sort of lavender maroon colored. Turquoise is a painstaking process in terms of mining and preparing and getting the stone ready for finished use and turquoise jewelry. A stone will be handled at least a dozen times by the time it's taken and excavated from the mine and ready for finished jewelry. And with the Bisbee, Arizona, lavender pit gets its name in the process of tumbling. The water that's used to tumble the turquoise actually turns a lavender purple color. So that's where it got its name. Turning the time back over to Dr. Palke.
Thank you, Emerald. Really fascinating material. So back to turquoise gemology. I want to give you guys a little bit of a view of how a gemologist would look at turquoise, especially in terms of what we do in the gemological laboratory with turquoise and things we look out for, and things that you guys should look out for as well. If you are thinking about picking up some turquoise, there are certain types of treatments and certain ways of evaluating the quality of a turquoise that you should at least be aware of in terms of looking for the turquoise for yourself. So turquoise gemologically, like I said, is this aluminum phosphate, hydrated aluminum phosphate with copper in it. Refractive index is 1.61 to 1.65. Specific gravity of 2.74. It's usually inert to fluorescence. It might have weak greenish yellow fluorescence in long wave, but it's inert in short wave. And again, it's formed through the secondary alteration of copper deposits. And so as you can see on this specimen on the right, turquoise is really like it's a rock, right? And it's got, like Emerald pointed out, one of the factors of turquoise that we consider is this matrix. And this matrix is really a reflection of the geological conditions of the turquoise formation and the fact that this is really a natural product. So what would you look for in terms of turquoise evaluation? So color is probably one of the first things we might consider. Now, the color is one of the biggest factors in turquoise, and the most kind of revered color, I would say, the most sought after color is this robin's egg blue, and especially with even coloration of this robin's egg blue tends to be more highly favored, especially in the very high-end turquoise jewelry. But there is this continual variation in color from blue all the way into green. And we'll take a little bit of a look at that. So what's going on with the color of turquoise? We're going to look at a UV vis absorption spectrum. So what this basically is showing is you have the wavelengths of light across the horizontal axis from 400 to 700 nanometers. This represents different wavelengths of light that produce different colors in our eyes. So at the shorter wavelengths, we have bluish colors. We have going into greens in the 500 nanometer region, and then into red color in the 700, 600 nanometer region. And this absorption spectrum tells us basically how much of this light that falls onto the turquoise gets absorbed by the turquoise and how much gets reflected back to our eyes. So at higher levels of absorbance, more of that light is absorbed by the turquoise and it doesn't get returned to us. So what we see in the absorption spectrum here, we had this big bump going into the 600 nanometer region. This big broad band is related to copper. And so this is really the main reason for color in turquoise, is that all of this red light in the 600 to 700 nanometer region gets absorbed when it hits the surface of the turquoise, leaving all of this blue light to be reflected back to our eyes. And one thing more to point out, this little absorption band here, this sort of narrow band at around 440 nanometers, this is related to iron in the structure of turquoise. And the iron substitutes for aluminum in the structure. And the more iron you put in the structure tends to be the more green you get in your turquoise. So that's shown here with this greenish turquoise that has more iron in the structure. It's got a more intense iron absorption band here. And so you can all of a sudden see that the copper is absorbing all of the red light. The iron is starting to absorb more of that blue light. And that leaves a much smaller transmission window, or much more smaller reflection window for that light that gets reflected back to our eyes. And that's reflection window is kind of centered around more of the greenish part of the spectrum rather than the blue part of the spectrum. Now, again, some fantastic examples of some high-end jewelry with this really even blue robin's egg color. But also, as one thing kind of Emerald alluded to, we shouldn't really discount the matrix. The matrix can actually be a really good quality of the turquoise, and it can be something that people really desire in turquoise. And different mines produce the different types of matrix, and people desire different types of an appearance in the matrix. And when a stone is really well cut, when a really high-end stone is really well cut, that matrix can really be part of the beauty of the stone. But again, one thing to point out, this is a natural product and it's a rock. And one thing rocks have are pores. And so it's important to point out that the gemstones that come out of the ground, the turquoise that comes out of the ground that can be directly used in jewelry is relatively rare. A lot of the turquoise produced is lower grade. It's got more of these pores in the structure. It might be less stable. It might be a little more friable. And so there are certain things people can do to take some of that lower quality material and still turn it into beautiful jewelry, and making this kind of beautiful stone more accessible to more people in the general public. So I want to just go over briefly some of the treatments you might see in turquoise, mainly so that you guys can be aware of what's going on and aware of what you should be considering when you're looking for turquoise for yourself. So I'm going to kind of go in order of treatments that go further and further away from the natural material. So the first step away from natural untreated turquoise is stabilization. A lot of turquoise will benefit from stabilization, and that's kind of shown in this photo here. This rough piece on the left is untreated, and it has this sort of chalky appearance to it. It's kind of lighter in tone. It might be slightly friable. And what's happening here is this turquoise might have a higher porosity than a lot of the natural untreated material you would see. And so that porosity, when light hits that stone, those pores in the turquoise will scatter light, causing a lighter tone, and it doesn't really bring through the color of the turquoise quite as well. So one thing people can do is try to fill up those pores. And this not only can increase the color, as you see here, the stone on the right has been treated through a process called the Zachary treatment. And by increasing the porosity, filling up those pores, you can get rid of some of that scattering, you darken the tone, but not only improving the color, but also stabilization can simply make a stone harder. It can make it more stable, and make it a little better for putting into jewelry, so that your turquoise will last longer and be there for, for a longer period of time. So there's two ways in which you can stabilize your turquoise. You can, the most common is probably polymer impregnation, where you would take some sort of a resin or a plastic and impregnate the stone with that resin or plastic to fill the pores and to increase the stability of the stone. The second is the Zachary treatment. And this is actually a proprietary treatment that we don't have a whole lot of details on the exact process that is going on with the Zachary treatment. We know how to identify it in the lab, and we know what it does. It sort of fills in the pores of the stone. It makes the turquoise harder, and it can improve the color. And actually this stone on the right is a Zachary treated stone. So how would we identify this in the lab? Well, polymer impregnated stones could be identified through FTIR spectroscopy. So that's Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy. This is a type of spectroscopy. It's different from the UV-Vis spectrum I showed earlier, but it's a way of looking for especially organic materials. A lot of organic materials respond very well to FTIR spectroscopy. And so when we're looking for plastics or resins or polymers that shouldn't be in an untreated turquoise, they will stand out very readily with FTIR spectroscopy. Another thing you might do is use a hot point. If you were to take a hot needle against the surface of a polymer impregnated turquoise, you might start to see some sweating of those polymers as shown in these photos when applying the hot point. A heavily impregnated stone might also have a slightly lower refractive index, so that's another thing you could potentially look out for. Now, Zachary treatment, even though we don't really understand exactly what's going on with the treatment, how it's actually working, we do know that whatever they're doing to the stones is introducing a lot of potassium into them. So we use this technique called X-ray fluorescence. And if we see a lot of potassium in a turquoise, this is something we don't typically see in natural turquoise, then we can confidently identify that stone as being Zachary treated. So taking another step further away from the natural untreated material, the next treatment would be dyeing. So in addition to filling pores, a stone with sort of lower color with lighter tone, not very saturated blue or green, might have artificial coloration introduced, especially alongside polymers or other materials that you would impregnate. So if you're going to impregnate the stone with some sort of polymer, you might also introduce a dye in order to significantly improve the color. And again, this is typically identified with microscopy. So turquoise being sort of a natural product with fractures and fissures and pores, when you introduce a dye in artificial coloration, you would tend to see the concentration of that dye within cracks, within pores, things you wouldn't see in a natural turquoise where the color would be distributed much differently than in a dyed material. Now, again, taking even another step away from natural untreated turquoise, we would get to matrix reproduction. So even though that evenness of the color, the evenly no matrix turquoise can be valued in some parts of the jewelry market, a lot of people really want that matrix, and it kind of reminds you of this natural product. And so turquoise that doesn't have matrix or that might not have very attractive matrix can be treated and with artificial matrix. People can try to reproduce that natural feel and that natural look to the stone through artificial methods. And this is a really interesting example shown here. This was a turquoise with some pits and some divots in its natural surface. And whoever fashioned the stone took this material. You can see a photomicrograph, an up-close photomicrograph of what they filled it with. It was some sort of polymer, apparently, with some little shards of pyrite mixed in with it. And so they took these little shards of pyrite with whatever else they filled that stone with, and they attempted to recreate some natural leaking matrix with this. And you can see obviously some bubbles here. You can see also this interface between two different kind of stages of the matrix reproduction, where they apparently filled it once and it didn't really quite take fully, so they had to try to fill it again with this artificial matrix. This will happen sometimes, and it's typically pretty readily obvious when you look at the stone in a microscope. This doesn't really look natural. It might look sort of natural from far away, but when you look at it in the scope, when people try to reproduce this matrix artificially, it tends to be fairly obvious, and it tends to have an artificial look to it in the microscope. The next step away from natural turquoise, again, is reconstructed turquoise. So when you're running a turquoise mine, the really fine pieces are kind of few and far in between. You don't really get most of the material in the really high-end grade of turquoise. So a lot of the stuff you get in a turquoise mine is going to be fragments and bits and little pieces of turquoise that you might not otherwise have a use for. So one thing people have realized that they could do with those little fragments and bits of turquoise is they start to mix it with some sort of an organic binder, and then they'll exert enormous pressures on this mixture of turquoise and the binder. You put it in a hydraulic press, for instance, and over time, you apply enough pressure, you can get that material, that mixture, to cement itself into basically a big block of turquoise plus the binder. And so this material shown here, this block of reconstructed turquoise, this little cylinder of reconstructed turquoise, it is made up of some natural turquoise, but it's also, we would consider this to be sort of a manufactured product. So even though it's made of natural turquoise, it's quite far removed from the natural untreated material that is, highly sought after in the trade. And I'll just round this off with the final removal from the natural turquoise. Again, this would be lab-grown turquoise and simulants. So simulants like dyed howlite And people will use this dyed howlite to quite good, with quite good results. The howlite works for this because the howlite sometimes has this natural matrix already. These veins going through it are already part of the howlite. And what they'll do then, the howlite doesn't occur in this natural blue color though, so they'll take this material, a completely different mineral, and they'll dye it. They'll introduce artificial coloration to it so that it has the appearance of turquoise, even though it's a completely different mineral. So this is one thing to look out for. The other thing would be lab-grown turquoise. And this is shown here. You'll notice one of the things to look out for lab-grown turquoise in the microscope, you'll get this, what they call cream of wheat effect, where the turquoise up close looks like a big bowl of cream of wheat if you've ever eaten that. They've also kind of mastered this technique of introducing this artificial matrix into some of this lab-grown material, which is shown in the middle bottom here. One thing you'll note with that though is in the natural turquoise, when you're cutting it and polishing it and fashioning it, the natural matrix often is undercut relative to the turquoise. The turquoise is typically fairly harder than that, than the matrix, and so you get a little undercutting of the matrix. You won't see that so much on this lab-grown material, and the lab-grown material simply sort of looks like it's artificial, right? It doesn't quite have the same feel of the natural turquoise. So that's what we look out for in the lab, and we want to end this with Emerald going over some of her fascinating pieces of jewelry. So I'll hand it over to Emerald from there.
Thank you so much. So turquoise, as it's used in Southwest Native American jewelry, that could be a presentation all in its own. As so many of the topics, as Dr. Palke and I were readying for this, it was really difficult to narrow things down for you all. So I wanted to go through just some examples of some of the tribes of the Native American Southwest, starting with the Zuni, who were some of the earliest, in addition to the, of course, Anasazi, Chaco, and Tewa Pueblo Native Americans, in terms of working and using the stone. Photoed here in the center is an example of a 5-piece Morenci, Arizona ceremonial dance piece. It's a necklace that was a collaborative piece done by Preston Manonia, and inlaid the turquoise leaves are done by David Saikua, a very well-known and celebrated jeweler of the American Southwest in Zuni Pueblo. My father, Joe Tanner Sr., started his career at Zuni and has always been such an astute collector and cultivator, almost a curator of Southwest Native American art. His collection is a collection of idea, who did it first, who did it best. And here is an example of Della Casaapa, this photo all the way to the left here in the center. That's Della, and she really deserves her own place in history, as she was one of the earliest female Native American jewelers. Prior to her making jewelry, which would have been about 1930, it was almost taboo for Zuni silversmiths to be women. Women typically were weavers or potters. And then the photo all the way to the right is an example of Della's squash blossom. I think what makes and separates Native American jewelry so special is that it was first made for personal adornment. Native Americans have such a deep respect and appreciation for the stone. It holds a great amount of cultural significance. And this squash blossom was Della's personal piece, and special to me, special to us, because it was actually mined by Grandpa Joe out of Arizona, Turquoise Mountain in Arizona, towards the Gilbert Claims. So there's an example of early Zuni cluster work. The next slide will show you a little bit more contemporary example of Zuni cluster work as it relates to how it looks and appears in the American market today. Mr. and Mrs. Warren Ondelacy were a husband-wife duo, which was not uncommon in Zuni Pueblo for husband and wives to collaborate and create pieces. But each of those stones that you see just perfectly balanced and set are all hand-cut, hand-polished, natural material. All of the pieces that I'm sharing with you today is natural material from the North American Southwest, with a big emphasis in the Arizona and Nevada properties especially. The next slide will show you examples of a little more refined Zuni Pueblo technique that we call needlepoint. Needlepoint started in the 1930s or so, and was really mastered by a woman, again, a woman silversmith named Edith Sabitse, who is just absolutely the queen bee of Zuni needlepoint. No one will argue with me when I say that. She's incredible. She's still producing a little bit today at the age of, I think she's in her early 80s now. She's one of Dad's longtime friends from Zuni Pueblo. And photo just next to it is an example of what the rough, tumbled Lone Mountain specimens look like. To create this piece that Edith did, there's a close-up shot because I wanted you to be able to kind of feel and appreciate the needlepoint technique that's so elegantly done. Her and Dad picked through about 110 pounds of rough turquoise just to get this material for this finished set. When you're working with turquoise for the sake of needlepoint and for the sake of cluster, oftentimes the artist really wants to avoid any use of matrix because they want that sort of clear blue sort of gemologist dream of what turquoise is, and gives you that really sky blue color and really allows you to appreciate the dimension and shape of the stone. The next example that I want to show you from Zuni Pueblo as well is inlay and fetish carvings. Fetish carvings is one of the longtime traditions from Zuni Pueblo. Oftentimes, natural turquoise takes its shape with tools used by Zuni Pueblo and other tribes of the American Southwest. Leo Poblano, Old Manlika de Dios, and David Saikyowa are arguably three of the most famous Zuni lapidary artists of our time. The turquoise that's used here, again, is all natural Arizona turquoise, that really beautiful sky blue color. Those pieces both created about 1960, but that central figure in the left photo, which is a traditional dancer from Zuni, just really incredible, intricate inlay, amazing craftsmanship within these pieces. The Zunis have such an appreciation, respect, and understanding for the stone. The next example I want to show you is a nice array of, I believe, there we go, the contemporary bead makers. Now, sort of a nod to our early bead makers of Tewa Pueblo, Santo Domingo, Tewa Pueblo, and the early turquoise or wampum traders. This is a contemporary piece that was done about 1970 by famed Hopi Navajo artist Cheryl Yestowa. You see quite a lot of turquoise beads and on the market today, but most of what you see has been commercially cut and manufactured, though it may be natural stone or incorporate some sort of stabilization. The cutting itself is done by a machine. What makes this technique so special is that all of these stones have been hand cut, beautifully graduated. The example of turquoise here comes from Nevada. Again, the famed Nevada state just hit such incredible turquoise. We could do a sampling of just Nevada properties and have a great time with that. But beautiful graduation, as you see in this 3-strand necklace, with the center Mediterranean coral just providing a beautiful contrast to the Navajo. Turquoise is really revered and adored. It's reminiscent to things that are so important to the Navajo, like water, or Father Sky represented here, and red being representative of Mother Earth. So Cheryl Yestowa luckily loaned her skill set to her daughter, Peeke Wadsworth, who is an incredible lapidary artist of our time, and one of so few that are actually doing these hand-rolled beads. I want to stress how difficult that is to do. For a piece like this, a good cutter will actually waste about 50% of their tumbled turquoise. An average cutter, you're losing about 70%. So really, really a difficult process and impressive, as you can see in this photo. Now, the next slide will show you examples of some of the Navajo lapidary work. Well, Navajos were mostly known to be silversmiths. An incredible amount of lapidary talent came out of Navajo with this iconic corn setting, that sort of pillowed effect, and a word called mosaic setting, which is sort of alike to fitting puzzle pieces together. In the far left photo, you see an image of a traditional kachina dancer, and it's set against the mosaic inlay. Those pieces were cut and shaped and formed to be flat, and so it's smooth to the touch with that sort of pillowed or corn setting on top of it. One thing I wanted to point out for the grouping in this photo is the use of stones. In addition to turquoise, you see accentuations of Mediterranean coral, white shell, little bit of black Acoma jet. Navajo has 4 sacred stones representative of their 4 sacred mountains, which is jet, white shell, abalone shell, and of course turquoise. This represents also the 4 directions and the 4 sacred mountains, each of those stones serving to delineate the geographical boundaries of Navajo or Deneta, Navajo land. So beautiful use of those 4 sacred stones pictured there. Also in the photo is Preston Monogna, who is one of the founding fathers of contemporary jewelry making alongside Loloma and Kenneth Begay. The next slide will show you an example of Navajo techniques sort of elevated into fine jewelry. To brag on my father a little bit, he had galleries in the American West in the 1960s and 70s and sort of contributed to this renaissance of Native American art being elevated to fine art. Dad took a trip to New York City in the 1960s and visited places like Cartier and Tiffany's and asked the jeweler to bring out their best example of turquoise, which interestingly enough was examples of really beautiful gem quality cut Persian turquoise. Dad took one look at the Persian and kind of smiled and said, Bisbee's better. So he came home and he selected a good amount of stones, not just from the Bisbee, Arizona property, but also the famed Lander Blue turquoise mine, which is what we call in the industry a hat mine. It produced just over 110 pounds of gem grade turquoise, and so really rare and scarce material, just produced fabulous spider web material. And Dad gave these pieces to artists Lee Yazzie and Raymond Yazzie to set in gold, and again really elevates the pieces as fine jewelry. There's such a huge amount of artists in the market today that are producing fine gem quality jewelry. The next slide is going to show you an example of some of the use of the stone in Pueblo, Anasazi, Chacoan style, or Kewa style, Santo Domingo style. This is a piece that's really kind of close to my heart. We started at the very beginning of the pandemic, in lieu of silver supply stores being open and access to silver was limited. Dad kind of got into some of his archive pieces and vaults and had unset pieces by Preston Monogna and had contemporary lapidary talent set the pieces. This is an example of a bracelet set by 31-year-old artist Brian Tom, who is just one of the most exciting lapidary talents of our time. He's both Santa Clara, Pueblo, and Navajo. So it's sort of a merge between the two different lapidary techniques and styles. This is a piece that's set with Old Cerrillos, New Mexico turquoise with those beautiful kind of greens and minty blues, alongside Blue Gem Nevada, which was a really important turquoise mine and huge contributor to the Southwest turquoise boom, both in the 30s and the 50s. The cuff was created originally in 1960 and finished just last year. So really beautiful piece. I wanted to end with this last slide. This is a piece that was done in 1980 by Lee Yazzie, who's arguably one of the most famous jewelers of our time, just an incredible lapidary smith in addition to being a wonderful silversmith. To loop back on why I truly feel Native American jewelry is so important and so revered is it's got the cultural ties and it's, again, art that was first made as personal adornment, and how grateful and blessed we are to wear and share these beautiful works of art. This is all composed of a stone called Newlander Royal Web, Nevada, which was a property my folks mined in the 1980s. My dad and my mother, Cindy, mined the property for several years and gave the stone to Lee Yazzie, who reminded him of blue corn, which is a staple of life to the Native American people. Corn is really important, not just to Navajo culture, but also to Hopi and other surrounding tribes. But you see beautiful accentuations of opal, Mediterranean coral, 14 karat gold, and of course, the Arizona Bisbee. So just incredible art you can wear, and such a pleasure to share some of these techniques of America's first citizens with you today. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Palke and Emerald. That was a great talk, and we have some really awesome questions coming in, so we'll take a few minutes and answer those. The first one's for you, Emerald. Can you tell us a little bit about when silversmithing started in the American Southwest?
Sure, sure. So, so much of how I understand Native American jewelry making comes from my artist friends of the area, my father, of course, my grandparents. But it's our understanding that the Mexican and Spanish silver trade happened when a lot of the Spanish settlers were coming up north. Was the introduction of silver, and the process was actually learned from Mexican silversmiths at the time. Being done by Navajo artists and Zuni artists of the time. That would have been the late 1800s, a little before the turn of the century, and continuing through the 19 teens.
Fantastic. Erin, can you tell us a little bit about the major differences between blue and green turquoise?
Yeah, so the blue and green turquoise is the main difference between blue and green turquoise is going to be the iron content. So the more iron you get in the structure, and the iron is replacing the aluminum in the structure. So, it's a copper aluminum phosphate. There's not really any less copper in the structure when you get the iron in there. The iron replaces aluminum. So what happens is the copper absorbs all of that red light in the structure. It lets all the blue light go through, but the iron absorbs right around 440 nanometers, which is where your blue light is. And the more iron you get, the more of that blue gets absorbed by the turquoise itself. And so only green light gets to be reflected to your eyes. And, these are, as I mentioned, these are supergene deposits, which means the original copper deposit was weathered away. Minerals like silicates and that sort of thing were weathered away, leaving behind copper, but not only copper, but aluminum and also iron are oftentimes left behind in that original weathered deposit. And so that iron sometimes does get incorporated into the turquoise structure as well.
Great question. All right, we have a question from Jack. He said, I thought copper was a metal, and yet the term copper mineralization is used. Can you explain copper mineralization?
Yeah, so what happens is, I sort of touched on this a little bit, but basically what happens is these big bodies of granite, and granite is just an igneous rock composed of quartz and feldspar mostly. This granite gets intruded into the crust, and it's a big body of molten rock initially. And so you crystallize out your quartz and feldspar, but whatever doesn't get trapped in those two minerals gets kind of left behind in the residual fluids. And those fluids then infiltrate into the country rock, and sometimes those fluids are now concentrated in copper. And so the copper can be deposited as copper metal, which you sometimes see. You'll see those nuggets of copper in these deposits. You sometimes get copper sulfides or copper oxides. There are different ways in which you can bond copper with other elements in these copper deposits. And, you have to refine those other minerals out to get the copper out. But what happens then is those copper, either the copper metal or the copper oxide and sulfides then get wet, and you introduce phosphate and aluminum into the structure, forming the turquoise. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, that's a great answer. All right, we have another really great question. Why does iron cause a green color in turquoise when it causes a blue color in stones such as copper-bearing tourmaline? I think that's a great question.
Yeah, it is. So in turquoise, the specific form of iron is iron 3+. And the iron 3+ tends to absorb around 440, 450 nanometers, whereas iron 2+ is what you might find in a tourmaline, for instance. And that tends to absorb more. Well, it's a little variable, but the iron 2+ in tourmaline at least absorbs around 700 nanometers, which is causing that blue color there. So it's the oxidation state of the iron.
Great. Can you both talk a little bit about red turquoise and if it's found in the Southwest?
Emerald, maybe you would know a little more about that.
I'm not familiar with red turquoise. I'm sorry. There's, of course, the use of Mediterranean coral and spondylus oyster, like this shell behind me, which produces a red and oftentimes appears in Native American jewelry alongside turquoise. So there may be a misconception that it is turquoise, but as far as I know, all of the red that you see used in Native American jewelry is either Mediterranean coral or not necessarily from the Mediterranean, but coral or spondylus oyster.
Great. And can you talk a little bit more about white buffalo turquoise or howlite?
That's not an area of mine that I'm the expert to talk about. I've certainly seen it used in the market a lot, the white buffalo. but don't feel like I have enough knowledge to share enough on it.
Okay, Aaron, can you tell us a little bit more about howlite and the differences between howlite and turquoise?
Yeah, so howlite is just a completely different mineral than turquoise. It in its appearance in its undyed state, it can sort of have the same look a little bit as a turquoise, but it's typically kind of whitish in color, and so it's not going to have that color of turquoise. But people take advantage of that matrix you sometimes see in the howlite, and then when they dye it, the combination of that natural sort of matrix in the howlite plus the artificial coloration can sometimes give an appearance of turquoise. So it's used as a turquoise simulant.
Great. All right, Aaron, this question's for you. Are there spectral or chemical tests that can be done to determine the source of turquoise?
Honestly, that's something we don't have a great handle on right now. We have analyzed turquoise from some different deposits like the Persian material, and I think we're starting to look a little bit at the Southwest American material, but we haven't really done a whole lot of tests. Emerald may comment on sort of the, I think there might be more use in terms of like the appearance of different types of turquoise for distinguishing them.
Again, not necessarily a scientific approach to it, but a telltale is a lot of the times the host rock that'll help you identify where exactly the turquoise comes from, as so many of the mines produce a really distinctive matrix, like the golden matrix that comes out of Battle Mountain Blue Gem, or the maroon lavender pit matrix that comes out of Bisbee.
Okay, wonderful. Aaron, can you speak a little bit about the matrices of ironstone versus sandstone and where you find the difference in the source?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit about that. So the matrix is often composed, in a lot of cases, of these iron minerals, and that's again because, like the copper, when you have this this weathering in this arid kind of warm environments, some of the minerals that weather away are silicates. What's left behind is copper and iron and that sort of thing. So often the matrix is composed of these iron oxides. I'm not too familiar with sandstone matrix. That might be something I'm not very familiar with. But I suppose if whatever's left behind in the matrix as this turquoise is forming, whatever geological materials in there could get left behind to be trapped in between the matrix.
Great. Emerald, do you mind telling us a little bit more about like the different colors of turquoise that you talked about earlier in jewelry? We've gotten a few questions about the design and the color usage.
Sure. The bluer the better typically for a lot of the artists. Artists really prefer to use stones like properties from Lone Mountain, Nevada, because when initially looking at the stone, you really see what you're going to get. An artist is going to spend a ton of time and focus creating this finished piece of jewelry. So they really prefer to use the quality materials that they have a good idea of what the finished product will look like upon first look of the stone. And then, as I said, it ranges from the deep dark blues into the deep dark greens, up into the sky blues, and almost everything in between. From so many of the properties, though a lot of the properties are most known to be a certain color, like cereos is oftentimes kind of synonymous with that green color. It's a common misconception because so many of the turquoise mines do produce a wide gamut and array of turquoise. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's great. All right, everyone. I think that is a wrap for today's talk. If you have any other questions, feel free to find us on our social media pages, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And thank you all for coming today. Also to Dr. Aaron Palke and Emerald Tannard for your time. Next week, we have another great knowledge session. We will be joined by Dr. Aaron Palke again and Joanna Joy C2 to learn all about red gemstones, the history, lore, and gemology.